1893. In a single year, a quarter of every mile of railroad track in America falls into the hands of the courts. The biggest, richest, most modern corporations the country had ever produced bankrupt, together, almost at once. They weren't badly run. Many were brilliantly run. The thing that killed them was built into the track the day it was laid. Here's what it was. Because the story you were taught about the railroads is simple, and it's wrong. You put down 2 rails. You buy some cars. You haul wheat and coal and people from one town to the next, and you charge them for the ride. Lay the track, fill the cars, collect the fare. That's the picture in every school book. It is clean, it is obvious, and it explains almost nothing about how these companies actually made and lost staggering amounts of money, because a railroad was never really a transport company. Hold on to that. By the time we're done, the trains are going to look like the least important thing the railroad owned. So, the flip. A railroad was 2 businesses wearing a train as a disguise. It was a land company, and it was a finance company. The trains were the part that tied the other 2 together and, very often, the part that lost money on purpose. Think about what that means. The thing you picture when you picture a railroad, the locomotive, the freight, the ticket, is the part that mattered least to the people who got rich. The money was somewhere else entirely. It was in the ground the track ran across, and it was in the paper the company sold to build the track in the first place. Here's the promise I'll make you, and I'll keep it. By the end of this, you'll understand why 2 perfectly healthy railroads running side by side would drive each other into the dirt on purpose. You'll understand why the government gave these companies an area of land larger than most countries on Earth, and why that gift was also a trap. And you'll understand why, in 1893, the strongest of them didn't fail because they were weak. They failed because they were exactly what they were designed to be. The same thing that built them is the thing that buried them. That's the shape of it. A machine so elegant, it looks like genius from one side and like a death sentence from the other. Let's build the machine first, because you can't feel the collapse until you've seen how beautiful the thing was on the way up. Start with the land. In the middle of the 19th century, the United States had a continent it didn't control. Millions of square miles of it mapped, claimed on paper, and completely empty of the people and the commerce that would make it worth anything. Land with no one on it is not wealth. It's just distance. The government had one asset in enormous supply, that empty land, and one thing it desperately wanted: track laid across it. So it made a trade that seems insane until you see the logic. It paid the railroads in dirt. For every mile of track a company laid, it received square miles of land in a checkerboard along the route, alternating sections stretching back from the line on either side. And the totals here are hard to hold in your head. Across roughly 2 decades, the federal government signed over on the order of 130 million acres to the railroads. The states handed over tens of millions more on top of that. Put those together, and you're looking at something in the neighborhood of 180 million acres, an expanse larger than most nations that exist today, transferred out of public hands and into the hands of a few dozen corporations. Not sold, not leased. Given in exchange for the promise of track. And notice how the checkerboard itself was designed to compound. The government didn't hand over one solid block, it gave alternating squares, like the black squares on a chessboard, and kept the others for itself. The theory was sharp. Once the railroad arrived and the squares it owned filled with paying settlers, the empty squares the government had held back would shoot up in value too, and the public would recover its gift twice over. Whether it ever really worked out that evenly is still argued over by historians. But the design tells you exactly how everyone in the room was thinking. Nobody believed they were funding a transport service. They were seeding a real estate boom and using the promise of track to set it off. Now sit with the elegance of that for a second, because this is the part that's genuinely brilliant, and if you skip past it, you'll misread everything that follows. The land, on the day it was granted, was worth almost nothing. That's the whole point. It was worthless precisely because it was empty. But a railroad has a power no ordinary landowner has. It doesn't just own the land. It owns the thing that makes land stop being empty. The track is a machine for manufacturing value out of distance. Run a line through a dead stretch of prairie, and you haven't moved the dirt an inch, but you've changed what the dirt is. Yesterday it was nowhere. Today it's a place you can ship a crop out of, and ship a plow into, Today someone will pay for it. That's the trick underneath the whole enterprise. The railroad was handed the raw material for free, and it also owned the only tool on earth that could turn that raw material into money. It could stand at both ends of the transaction. It manufactured the value, and then it sold the thing it had made valuable. Show me another business in history that got to do that. This is why the smartest money in the country poured toward the rails. From the outside, it looked like a transport play. From the inside, the people building these things knew exactly what they were sitting on. They weren't in the business of moving freight, they were in the business of alchemy. Let me make that concrete, because alchemy is a big word, and the mechanism is actually very specific. Let's follow a single stretch of empty ground and watch it turn into money. Picture a patch of prairie in the 1870s. Nobody's there, no name on the map. The railroad owns it because the government gave it away by the mile. On its own, it will sit there worthless for 100 years. So the railroad does something that looks, at first, like generosity. It builds a town, it surveys a grid, it sets down a depot. And here's the move. It plats out streets and lots around that depot and it starts selling them. Often it starts selling them before the track even reaches the site. The railroads ran entire departments for exactly this. Land bureaus with a single job. Turn the grant into cash. And they didn't wait for buyers to wander by. From the late 1860s onward, the big Western lines opened immigration offices across Europe, printing pamphlets, running agents, actively recruiting families off other continents to come and buy a piece of a town that, a year earlier, did not exist. They advertised the American prairie across Germany and Scandinavia in the settlers' own languages, arranged the passage, and sometimes carried the newcomers the last leg for free. Think about how strange that generosity is, until you see the logic. A family that can't afford the ticket today will pay freight for 40 years once it's routed to the line. The free ride wasn't charity. It was the down payment on a lifetime customer. Watch what's actually happening to the money here, because it runs in a loop that feeds itself. The railroad sells a lot to a family. That's revenue clean, immediate revenue that has nothing to do with hauling anything. But now that family lives there. They grow wheat that has to get to market. They buy tools and lumber and coal that have to come in. Every one of those is a shipment. And who owns the only line out of town? The company that sold them the lot. So the land sale isn't the end of the transaction. It's the beginning of a subscription. Sell the lot once, and you've manufactured a customer who will pay you to ship in and out for the rest of their working life. The freight was never really where the profit lived, but the freight was the leash. It's what tied the settler to the line permanently, so that the one-time land sale became a lifetime of dependence. This is the thing to understand about a railroad town. It was not a town that happened to get a railroad. It was a product the railroad built and sold, and the people living in it were, in the coldest financial sense, the recurring revenue. The company didn't populate the West because settlers arrived. Settlers arrived because a company needed the town to exist. And every town made the next stretch of empty land, the next grant down the line worth building toward. Now we come to the part of the machine that nobody sees, and it's the part that will eventually do the killing. To lay the track that turns the land into money, you first have to build the track. And building track costs more money than any human being on Earth actually had. This is easy to miss, because we're so used to it now. But step into the 1850s and it's genuinely new. A cotton mill, a foundry, a merchant house, the biggest businesses of the earlier era could be funded out of one wealthy family's pocket or a handful of partners. They needed thousands, maybe a few million. A trunk railroad needed hundreds of millions, in an age when that sum simply did not exist inside any single fortune. For the first time in the history of business, the thing you wanted to build cost more than the richest man could pay for it. So the railroad had to invent a way to gather money from strangers, thousands of them, most of whom would never see the track, and it had to invent the machinery to do it. This is not a side effect. This is one of the most consequential things the railroads ever did, and it had nothing to do with trains. To fund themselves, they built out the modern capital market. Corporate bonds sold to the public on a scale never seen before, stock traded by people who had no hand in running the company, and because no owner could possibly manage something this big, and this dispersed themselves a brand new creature, the salaried professional manager. running an enterprise he didn't own on behalf of shareholders he'd never meet. Historians of business treat this as the birth of the modern corporation itself, the first time ownership and management split into two different sets of people. And it wasn't only finance they had to invent. Someone had to coordinate thousands of miles of track, tens of thousands of employees, and trains that would kill each other if a single schedule slipped by minutes, and no owner could hold all of that in his own two hands. So the railroads grew the first real corps of middle managers, career men running divisions they didn't own, reporting up a chain of command that looked, for the very first time, like the modern company you've probably worked inside your whole life. The org chart is, in its bones, a railroad invention. The railroad didn't just use Wall Street. In a real sense, the railroad is why Wall Street and the whole salaried, managerial world bolted onto it became what it is. And here's where the elegance starts to curdle. When you're raising that much paper from strangers, the paper itself becomes something you can play games with. The stock stopped being a clean claim on a real company and became something you could inflate. There's a name for it that comes straight out of the cattle trade: watered stock. Ranchers used to feed cattle salt and let them drink heavily right before a sale, so the animal weighed more at the scale than it was truly worth. Financiers did the identical thing to shares: issue new stock backed by nothing, watering the company until the paper on the market bore no honest relationship to the rails and cars underneath it. On the Erie line in the late 1860s, a trio of operators simply printed fresh shares to fight a takeover and offloaded something on the order of $7 million of that watered paper onto a rival who thought he was buying a railroad. He was buying air. And the watering wasn't even the most brazen trick. On the Union Pacific, half of the first line ever to cross the continent, the insiders ran a scheme that's almost elegant in its nerve. The same men who owned the railroad quietly set up a separate construction company, gave it a grand French name, and then hired that company to build their own line. Sitting on both sides of the table, they billed themselves whatever they pleased. By the time it unraveled, that construction outfit had charged the railroad something like $72 million for work that cost closer to 53, the gap walking straight into the owner's pockets, and very nearly gutting the railroad on the way. When Congress started sniffing around, they simply handed discounted shares to congressmen until the questions stopped. Sit with what that tells you. The men building the Transcontinental Railroad made more money looting the financing of it than they ever expected to earn running trains across it. The paper was the prize. The railroad was almost the byproduct. Feel where this leaves the machine. The railroad now sits on a mountain of debt and stocks some of it real, some of it pure water, and that mountain doesn't care whether the trains are full. The bondholders have to be paid. The interest comes due on a schedule that has nothing to do with the harvest, nothing to do with the weather, nothing to do with whether anyone rode the train this month. The company has bolted a fixed, relentless, monthly demand for cash onto a business whose income is anything but fixed. Remember that. The debt is patient with no one. So far, every problem has come from inside the machine. Now watch what happens when two of these machines meet. Here is the strangest fact about a railroad, and it's the one everything hinges on. Once the track is down, carrying one more ton of freight costs the company almost nothing. The rails are already paid for. The bridges are built. The train is already running. Adding another loaded car to it is, in cash terms, a rounding error. Economists have a phrase for the gap between what a thing costs to build and what it costs to use one more time: fixed cost versus marginal cost. And the railroad was the first giant business in history where the fixed cost was nearly everything, and the cost of one more customer was nearly nothing. Sounds like a dream. It's a trap, and here's how it springs. Suppose two railroads run between the same two cities. Both need to fill their cars, because an empty car earns nothing, and the bondholders are still waiting. So one drops its rate a little to steal the other's freight. The rival can't afford to lose the business, so it cuts back. The first cuts again. And because carrying that extra ton costs each of them almost nothing, there is no natural floor to the fight. The rational price for the next ton of freight always drifts towards zero because any price above zero is better than an empty car. Two healthy railroads, side by side, will rationally cut each other's throats all the way down to the point where neither can pay its debts. Not because anyone is stupid, Because the math of near-zero marginal cost gives them no choice. The men running these companies were not fools, and they saw the cliff coming, so they did the obvious thing. They tried to stop competing. They formed pools, secret agreements to fix rates and split the traffic so nobody had to fight, and it never held. It couldn't. The instant everyone agrees to keep prices up, each one has an overwhelming private incentive to quietly cheat, shave his rate, and grab the freight, because remember, one more car costs him almost nothing. The cartel that's rational to join is rational to betray. Every pool rotted from the inside on the same logic that created it. And it wasn't only the railroads who felt the whipsaw. Out in the farm country, the same wild swings landed on people who couldn't survive them, a rate that was bearable one season and ruinous the next, set by a company they had no power over. Whole movements of angry farmers organized against the lines, and states began passing their own laws to cap what a railroad could charge. Then in 1886, the Supreme Court knocked those state laws down, ruling that a single state couldn't regulate traffic crossing its borders, which left a vacuum that only the federal government could fill. So in 1887 it did, passing the first great regulatory act of the modern era, aimed squarely at the railroads, banning the pools outright. It's worth being honest here about how well that worked, because the tidy version says the government rode in and fixed it. It didn't, not at first. The law was, by most accounts, close to toothless. For years, it outlawed the pools without curing the disease that made men reach for them. And that's the tell. When a problem keeps reappearing no matter how many times you outlaw the symptom, the problem isn't the men, and it isn't the greed. It's built into the structure. Which brings us to the turn. Here's the flip, and it's the whole point of the story, so let it land. Everything I've described so far, the free land, the value manufactured out of distance, the ability to carry one more ton for almost nothing, every one of those is a strength. It's exactly why the railroads looked unstoppable. But look at that last one again from the other side. The very same feature, turned 90 degrees, is the thing that kills them. The strength was, our costs are already paid, so we can carry more freight for almost nothing. The death sentence is the identical sentence read backward. Our costs are already paid whether or not we carry any freight at all. That is not two facts, it is one fact, seen from two sides. The track cost the same whether 1,000 trains ran on it or none. The bond payment came due the same in a boom and in a bust. The enormous fixed cost that let them crush a competitor on price is the exact same fixed cost that crushes them when the freight dries up. This is why the collapse was never about empty trains. That's the mistake everyone makes. They picture a railroad failing because nobody rode it. But a railroad with empty cars and no debt could sit and wait for better times. The empty car costs almost nothing to park. The thing that couldn't wait was the debt. The fixed cost doesn't pause when business slows. It doesn't negotiate. It arrives on the first of the month in a depression exactly as it does in a boom, and it has to be paid out of income that has just collapsed. The railroad's problem was never filling the trains. The railroad's problem was that the track and the debt that built it cost the same whether anyone rode it or not. And now, the free land closes the trap from the other direction. All that borrowing was justified by the fantasy that the land and the traffic would always grow, that next year's settlers would always cover this year's interest. The debt was built for a machine that only ever expands. So the moment expansion stalls, the moment the next town doesn't fill fast enough, the same structure that made growth so profitable makes contraction fatal. There's no gentle setting. The machine has two modes, manufacturing wealth on the way up and manufacturing ruin on the way down, and it flips between them the instant the freight stops growing. Same edge, both sides cut. Ch. 8. The collapse detonate 1893. Which is exactly what happened, and now the date from the beginning stops being mysterious and starts being inevitable. The wider economy cracks, banks fail, credit freezes, freight volumes fall off a shelf. For a normal business, a downturn is painful. For a machine built entirely out of fixed cost and debt, a downturn is a guillotine. The income drops, and the interest payments don't. That's the whole equation, and there's no third variable to save you. And notice what receivership actually meant, because it's stranger than plain bankruptcy. The trains didn't stop. The Northern Pacific was still running the day after it failed. So were the others. The rails were still there. The freight still moved. The towns still needed the line. What had failed wasn't the railroad as a physical thing. It was the tower of paper stacked on top of it. The court stepped in not to shut the trains down, but to referee the brawl among the bondholders over a company that could still carry freight and still could not possibly pay what it owed. That's the tell of the whole story in one image. The machine worked perfectly. The finance strapped to it did not, so they went down. Not the weak ones, the giants. The Northern Pacific, the Union Pacific, the Santa Fe, three of the grandest names in the country, the transcontinental spines of the American West, all sliding into the hands of court-appointed receivers within months of each other. And it wasn't isolated. When the dust settled, something on the order of a quarter of all the railroad mileage in the United States had passed into receivership, and by some counts, closer to a third of the total went through bankruptcy in the years that followed. Roughly 40,000 miles of track, more than 100 separate companies, all failing on the same logic at the same time. Sit with the strangeness of that. This wasn't a few badly managed outfits getting weeded out while the sound ones survived. The largest, most sophisticated, most admired corporations in America failed together, almost simultaneously, in a single coordinated wave. When the best-run companies in an entire industry fail all at once, you are not looking at a failure of management. You are looking at a failure of the design. Every one of them was standing on the same fault line because it was the same fault line that had made every one of them rich. The 1893 collapse wasn't a run of bad luck landing on a lot of separate firms. It was one structural flaw, present in all of them from the first mile of track, coming due on the same day. And this is the part I most want you to hold, because it's the part the cynical version gets wrong. It would be easy, and it would feel good, to say these men were greedy fools. That they overbuilt, overborrowed, watered their stock, and got what they deserved. Some of them were crooks. The watered stock was real, the manipulation was real. I won't pretend otherwise. But greed doesn't explain the pattern, and here's how you know. The honest operators failed right alongside the crooks. A perfectly ethical railroad man, running a clean set of books, still had to borrow enormous sums to lay track, because the track cost more than any fortune. He still faced a rival who could rationally cut rates towards zero. He still owed fixed interest out of income that could vanish. Do everything right, and the structure still has you. That's the thing to understand. Every actor in this story was making a rational move given the board in front of them. Take the government's giant land grant. From where they stood, it was reasonable it got a continent connected in a single generation, faster than any market would have managed alone. Take the borrowing. Rational, the returns on the way up were real and enormous, and no one builds a transcontinental line out of pocket change. Take the rate cutting that ate everyone alive. The single most rational thing each railroad could do, ton by ton, was exactly the thing that, added up, destroyed them all. Nobody in this story is an idiot. That's what makes it a trap instead of a blunder. A blunder is when someone makes a mistake. A trap is when everyone makes the correct decision and the structure converts all that correctness into ruin. And if you want the proof that it was the structure and not the men, look at the one who lived. While the giants went down together, a single transcontinental line came through 1893 still standing. The Great Northern, built by a man named James Hill. Look at how he'd built it. He took almost none of the free government land the others gorged themselves on. He obsessed over the flattest, straightest, cheapest route he could find, hunting down the lowest pass across the divide so the grade would never cost him a wasted dollar again. He carried less debt, and he built for the traffic that actually existed rather than the traffic he hoped to conjure. Now Hill didn't survive because he was a purer soul than the rest. Plenty of the men who failed were perfectly honest. He survived because he'd swallowed less of the exact poison that killed them. Less free land pulling him to overbuild. Less debt standing on the first of the month demanding to be fed. The survivor is the proof of the diagnosis. It was never the character of the men. It was how much of the trap each one had laid into his own track. So the railroads weren't a story about bad men. They were a story about a machine that punished good ones the same way and spared only the man who'd built less of the machine. So strip away the locomotives and the land grants and the century, and here's the law underneath, the thing this whole story is really an example of. When a business lives on enormous fixed costs and almost no cost per extra customer, it becomes two opposite things at once. On the way up, it's the most powerful money machine ever built, because every new customer is nearly pure profit, and it can crush anyone who tries to compete on price. On the way down, it's a trap with no floor, because the same crowd of competitors will rationally cut prices to nothing, and the fixed costs go right on, demanding to be paid whether the customers show up or not. The strength and the fragility are not two features you can separate. They are the same feature, and you don't get one without the other. Once you can see that shape, you start seeing it everywhere. The fixed cost is enormous, and the next customer is nearly free. It's the reason certain modern industries, the ones where you spend a fortune building the thing and almost nothing serving one more user, tumble toward monopoly, toward brutal price wars, and then toward someone begging for regulation. In that exact order, the same sequence the railroads ran a century and a half ago. Enormous cost to build the first copy, almost nothing to serve the next user, and then the whole grim choreography follows on its own. The race toward one dominant winner, the ruinous price wars among the ones who refuse to die quietly, and finally the calls for someone, anyone, to step in and impose order from outside. Different century, different machine, identical edge. I won't name names. You can feel which industries fit the shape, but leave the last word with the trains, because they earned it by being the decoy this whole time. Everyone always thought the railroad's problem was whether it could fill the cars. It never was. The cars, full or empty, were almost beside the point. The railroad's problem, the one built into it the day the first rail went down, the one that made a quarter of the country's track collapse in a single year, was simpler and far more merciless than that. The track cost the same whether anyone rode it or not,